Okay, so first up, in terms of assignment 5, I've decided that everyone gets a 10 for assignment 5. So rather than, I started putting it together and I realized is that, it's given this finals time next week, might be best just to go with 4 assignments for the year rather than 5. So it just means everyone will get a full credit for assignment 5. So congratulations, you all did well. I'll go ahead and I'll send out an announcement that basically says that, that there's no assignment 5. Assignment 5 is just the, well, everyone will just get 10 points for it. I was going to give you for assignment 5, I was going to, give you things from the survey results and then have you go through and kind of put together tables and things like that. But I realized as I was going through the survey is that it may be something that we just sort of do together in class here. So you can kind of see what, how it works. And I thought, well, it might be a little bit too much to kind of give you for you to do on your own in the last week of class. So we'll do it after we get done with outcome evaluation. We'll talk about it. Midterm is next Thursday, so a week from today, or the final is next Thursday, a week from today. All the study materials are online. We'll have a review session on Tuesday. Any questions about anything with the midterm? I'll check the chat, but also you can just ask me. Let's see. Rudy, you'll be having office hours next Wednesday.
Yeah.
I have office hours on Tuesday, and then so I have office hours on Tuesday. So if you have any questions, just go ahead and stop in the office hours or give us is the review on Zoom or in class? The review is on Zoom. Any other questions? Okay, not seeing any. We're going to go ahead and just proceed. So I want to finish up. We were talking about evaluation. And part of the reason I really wanted to kind of go through evaluations is that evaluations is kind of one of the key things that public health people tend to do when they get jobs, is they do evaluations. And so what we've done is we've gone through the, kind of what a formative evaluation is, which is essentially looking at how evaluating how the program is or intervention is being developed. We then went through a summative evaluation, which is kind of like a formative evaluation. It tends to go from the, from the development of the program to how it's going to be implemented, but they're related because oftentimes when you do a summative evaluation, you're going through. So I'll give you an example. I think I was using the example of the diabetes prevention program that I was involved in with Merced. So the first part of it was to get together, like a stakeholder group and decide how it was that, what we were going to do. So we probably had 6 months of meetings to try and decide what we're going to do along the way, for this program. And so during those 6 months of meetings, it was a lot of capacity building and team building. A lot of kind of going through and trying to figure out, what everyone sort of was hoping to get from the project, et cetera. And then at the end of that 6 months, we sort of had a plan that said, okay, we're going to focus on diabetes prevention programs. So that process, that 6 months process would be where you would do a formative evaluation, because what someone would do is come in at the very start, like when you start the process, and then just monitor and evaluate how things are going throughout. And the idea being is that then you provide feedback like, oh, there's not enough people who are being involved in decision making, or is this going to meet your goals, or things like that. So those type of things would happen in a formative evaluation. The next phase, so after we decided that we were going to go through and to do a diabetes prevention program, then the next phase was to implement it. And the program basically was, you have a call line where people could call, and that they would then be referred over to these classes, or people with Golden Valley who came to Golden Valley would be referred to the classes, or people who were in Mercy Hospital would be referred to the classes. So there were different, they had these different components. So the second phase was to go through and to see, well, all right, how's this actually going to work? Like, how do you get the people on the phone lines to know to refer people over, and who follows up with them, and those kind of nuts and bolts things. that's where a summative evaluation would come in. So a summative evaluation would come in and sort of say, okay, so, you know, this is what your goal was, this is how you're doing it. And if, for example, it turned out that the phone operators, you know, didn't know or didn't have the background to be able to refer people over, that then the summative evaluation, somebody would, you know, the evaluators would come through and say, hey, this is not going to work over here because your phone operators can't refer people. So then the team would go back and redo the program and say, all right, so how are we going to get referrals over? So that's why a summative evaluation oftentimes is linked to a formative, because if in the summative evaluation where you're focused upon how it's going to be implemented, things kind of come up, is that then, you know, you have to change the program. Okay, so that's a summative evaluation. So then after you've decided what you're going to do and you decide how you're going to do it and you've worked out the logistics, the next step is to actually do it. So the program went on for a year and a half. Year and a half, they had this program of, you know, referring people over and such. And so then a process evaluation would occur during that point. And the process evaluation would just be focused on, is the program doing what it said it was going to do? So if there were, you know, if it was going to rely upon people on the phone to basically refer people over, is that were the phone operators referring people? When, you know, if they're referring them to classes, were the classes actually going? Did the classes run the entire sessions? Were they following the program? That kind of more nuts and bolts, I mean, that type of thing about how it was actually being implemented, I mean, running, that's a process evaluation. But it's not an outcome evaluation, because there's nothing in that process evaluation which says, are we doing a good job or not? All it's doing is just saying, a process evaluation says, are we doing what we said we're going to do? Then you have an outcome evaluation, and the outcome evaluation then focuses upon actually, you know, were you successful in terms of doing what you want? That is, that you had these goals, you know, reduce diabetes or help prevent diabetes. And so were you actually doing that? So that's where the outcome evaluation comes in at the end, where you're trying to figure out kind of, was it successful or not? Now, the outcome evaluation, it should have the type of outcomes that are in the logic model. So if you remember, when we talked about that logic model, we said that that's where you kind of lay out how the sequence of how things are going to happen, and then what your outcomes are at the end of that. Well, the outcomes that you list in your logic model should be the outcomes that are you're going to follow in your outcome evaluation. So for example, and also is that it's important to kind of go through and to differentiate between outcomes and outputs. So if you remember in the logic model that we looked at, there is outputs and outcomes. And so outputs is just usually, that's a measure of kind of, you can think about throughput, or like what the program is sort of producing, right? Where outcomes isn't meeting your goals. For example, you can have a smoking cessation program where you're trying to get people, you know, to stop smoking. The output can be the number of clients who went through the program, but the outcome is whether or not they quit smoking. So outputs are just things that you can measure along the way that sort of say, you know, is this kind of doing what we think it's going to do? So process evaluation oftentimes focuses upon outputs, but outcome evaluations focus mostly upon outcomes, obviously. So the outcomes then can be, you know, can just vary depending upon upon what the type of program is, but they're typically broken into 3 different type of categories. They're broken into short-term, long-term, and short-term, intermediate, or long-term type of outcomes. So short-term outcomes, those are things like changes of knowledge or skills, or things that can kind of, where you can measure, you expect them to occur right away. Intermediate outcomes are typically behaviors, so that, you know, if you think about, you do an intervention on diabetes prevention, is like, and you go through and you measure, do they know at the end of this program, do they understand how to eat healthy, right? That's a knowledge one. So that's a short-term outcome. A behavior is the intermediate outcome. And a behavior would be something like, you know, well, are they starting to eat health? Do they actually eat healthier? That is, are they using more fruits and vegetables? Are they, you know, less fried food, etc.? Those are intermediate outcomes. Then your long-term outcomes are usually the things that you ultimately care about, which is like health status. You know, are they healthier overall? Are they, lower weight? Are they less likely to get diabetes? Those kind of things are more long-term type of outcomes. And so when you come through in that year, set up your logic model, then is that you sort of have your outcome targets. That is that you identify what it is that you think it is going to be sort of a success, going to mean success. And then you have your indicators. So for example, if you're going to go through and do diabetes prevention, is that, and you run diabetes prevention programs, is that your outcome could be, your ultimate outcome could be, your target is to reduce diabetes, rates of diabetes in Merced County, right? On the other hand, you're unlikely to see that for 10 years, 15 years along the way, because what you're doing is you're targeting people who are pre-diabetic. And so so what you're looking is like, are you going to prevent these people from getting diabetes at some point in the future? But that some point in the future could be a long way away. So oftentimes what we do in outcome evaluations then is that you have indicators, right? So indicators are like you're on the way to meeting your long-term targets. So an indicator could be something like number of people eating healthier, or the number of people who've lost weight, or things like that are indicators. It's not your ultimate goal, which is diabetes, but it's something that you can measure and you know is going to be related to your long-term outcome. Okay, so short-term outcomes, they're evaluations always include short-term outcomes because they're the easiest to measure. They're also the less, there's the link between your short-term outcomes and your long-term, kind of what you really care about, is often the weakest. So for example, just finding out that people have knowledge about how to eat healthy, about what diabetes is, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to actually change their behavior. And that doesn't mean that they're actually going to reduce their probability of getting diabetes. It's just so short-term outcomes are helpful because they can kind of measure the things right away that you want to measure to see if your project is being successful. But the problem with short-term outcomes is that the link between your short-term outcome and your long-term outcome may not be that close. Intermediate outcomes then typically require that you follow people over time. And so oftentimes intermediate outcomes would be, you're going to do a program or an intervention. You measure their knowledge and their intentions for behavior at the time that your program ends. Those are short-term outcomes. Then you follow people for a year to see at the end of that year, are they still adhering to what what you hope they're doing? That's your intermediate outcomes. Your medium-term outcomes is that what happens after a year. It's still not your long-term outcome, reducing diabetes, but it's an intermediate outcome. And then the long-term outcomes are what's going to happen in the future. Now in public health, oftentimes it's hard to get data on our long-term outcomes because, we typically in public health, when you're dealing with prevention, you're dealing with things that might occur only 15 to 20 years in the future. And so the common thing that we do in public health then is that when we go through that, we will be looking at some type of intervention like diabetes prevention. What we do is we get our short-term outcomes. We maybe get some medium-term outcomes, but then when you use different types of modeling techniques mean that you sort of say, all right, so if we get this type of trajectory for our long-term outcomes, for our intermediate outcomes, here's the probabilities and here's the pathways that can lead to sort of long-term type of outcomes. And so then you use the literature and use other type of ways to develop these types of models. So we don't have time to go through it in class, but just be aware that if you go through and you start to look at different types of papers, if you ever have to review review some type of, to see what type of program is going to be effective, what you'll find is that when you go through the outcome, the literature for any type of outcome that you're looking at, diabetes prevention, is that you're going to find some papers that deal with just short-term outcomes. And then the long-term outcome papers are probably going to be more modeling papers where they say, we did this type of intervention and here's our projections about what's going to happen in 20 years. They do those projections because they can't really follow people for 20 years. All right, and I gave you a paper to kind of look at. This is one on an outcome evaluation for public health approach to suicide prevention in an American Indian tribal nation. So what they do is they go through and they, if you go down here to the bottom, is that they talk about, essentially, they went through and that they did this type of program. So, here's your program. And that they talk about that they're doing an evaluation of it, and that they have 3 different type of outcome measures. They have suicide attempts, suicide gestures, and suicide completions. And then they follow it over this whole long period of time. So this is a true long-term outcome evaluation, because what they're doing is they're following it over these periods. And so then, so then it goes down, and then this is kind of what they're showing, right, is the graph over time. So then they go through and they talk about how, led to reductions, etc. The problem when you start to do long-term outcome evaluations like this is that, it's like if you look at this data, it kind of goes up and then it goes down, right? And then so that between the late 80s and the early 2000s, there's a decrease in most of them of the things you're measuring. Well, one thing you don't know is that, like, this was obviously a period where the program was implemented, and was probably implemented because they were having an issue. And so, they were having an issue, so they implemented this program, and then they'll track over time what happens. Well, what you don't know is you don't necessarily know what happens, what would happen if they didn't put in the program, right? So it could be is that you get these types of trends anyways. So oftentimes the problem when you start doing long-term outcome evaluations is finding a control group, right? Finding a group that you can compare it to say, oh, well, this group did this, and, and a similar group that had the intervention, they did this. So outcome evaluations become very tough to do, because they typically don't have, you just don't have a study for 20 years. And so you have to do things like, just compare it to other types of trends and other types of variants. But that's an outcome evaluation. All right. Any questions before I move on? All right, so seeing none. Okay, what I want to do, the final thing then, is to talk about your survey. So let me. So this is the data from your survey. So if you notice that, so going down, there are, about 70 something people in the survey who took the survey, right? Because, you have, and so if you notice that the way the survey is set up is that, you have start date, end date, status means like, is it going on? Then you have all these other things like IP address and such like that. You notice that what you don't have in this is you don't have any type of, you just have this respondent ID, which is just a randomly generated number, but you don't have anything that sort of says who it is that took the survey, because it is anonymous there. And then it starts here, question 27. So if you want to know, well, what's question 27? Well, what you have to do is that you have to go back and forth between the survey and, the survey data and the actual survey itself. So let me pull up the survey here. Okay, so you can all see the survey. So this is just taken from Qualtrics. So here's question 27 right there. Do you consent to participate in this study? And then it goes down, thank you. Question 2 is a thank you. And then so it really starts here with question 3. What year are you? Have you been at UC Merced the entire time, etc. And you'll notice that what Qualtrics does is that puts next to the question, like this one, it says a 1 and a 2. That means that if you go and you look at the actual survey data, survey data, for question, so let's see, here's question 27 over here. Then here's question 3, that was, what year you are. Here's this question, which is that, have you been at UC Merced the entire time? You're there. See, up here it sort of says the question. Have you been at UC Merced the entire time? What's your major? And then it lists all the majors. And then this one is, do you have a minor? Yes or no? 1 is no, 2 is yes. And if 2, then it asks them what their minor is. And then, now this is where you list all the classes. And so then here's all the classes that, kind of occurred. And then it goes through like this. But you'll notice is that there's like, especially if you get to here, there are some places that have, no responses, right? So people started the survey, but then they never finished it. And so what you have to do then when you first get a survey is to go through and basically weed out all of these ones, weed out all the variables that you don't need, and weed out the responses that are just, people didn't respond, or they started the survey and they stopped. So I did that. And what you end up with is something like this. So now there are basically 60 responses instead of 70. So a lot of people then, so I dropped about 10 of the observations, 10 to 15 of the observations were dropped because people didn't respond. Okay, so I'm going through this. So you notice that first thing I did is I went through and gave an ID number. So when you start a data, so this is all what I'm going to talk about now for the next 5 minutes is data management. And data management is really, really important because it's a type of job that you're likely to get where they're going to bring you in and say, hey, we've got this data set. And so, we want you to go through and to get our data set in shape for us to analyze. So the first step when you do data management is to go through and to, see how many valid responses you have. So that was the first thing we did. And then you cut out those for which there's non-valid. The other thing you do when you first start is you get a notebook and you keep a little notebook. You keep a list of everything you do all the way through. And you want to make sure when you save versions of the, after you get done making a change to the data set, you change it and give it a new name. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to make a change to the data set and then rewrite over your existing data, the original data, so it's gone. Because if you have to go back for some reason, if you find that you shouldn't have, deleted some variable and you have to go back, is that you're screwed because you've written over the data. So when you do data management, every time you make a change, just change it and call it something, a new date name. Like I usually use just version 1, version 2, and just, so I'll end up at the end of doing data management like this, cleaning up the data, I'd end up with maybe 10, 15 versions of the data set, because every time I make a change to the data set, I save it to a new data, a new name. So I make sure not to overwrite my existing one. Okay, so here you go. So this is, I put in an ID number. Then you notice that the next step is to go through and to put in variable names up here that you can use. Because, the variable names that were in the original data set, that were in this data set here is like, Q9.2, Q9.3, things like that. Things are not very helpful as you're going through and trying to figure out, what these questions mean. Because what you want is you want to have variable names so that you have a pretty good idea about what that question is asking. So the way you do that is you go back to your survey here and you start to look and you say, okay, so, question 27 up here says, do you want to consent? So I called the variable consent. And when you are doing so, when you're going through and cleaning up the data, what you do is that you then write the variable name right next to it, and this becomes what's called your it's your code book, so that anyone who picks up that data set can look at this code book and say, oh, okay, so question 27 is called consent. Then question down here, this is called year. And this question, well, let's see, that one's going to be called, I called it so we at UCM. See here? So essentially you do that for all of them then. So I went through and I renamed all the different variables going all the way through. So that's what this is all is. All these things then are the variables in the data set. So like if you look at, let's say this one, right? This one's called live off Thursday, right? So what this was if you live off campus and on Thursday, what time do you go to, what time do you go to class? Go to school. And this is live off travel Wednesday. So this is how long on Wednesday does it take you to get to school? So I've named them things that I can remember, but then I put them into that code book so that everyone can look at the question and say, oh, that's the variable. Okay. So once you do this, you get all your data set all set. Then your next step is that what I do is I read it into a program, and I read it into Stata. So the Stata data set, when it gets read in, this is what it looks like in Stata. I'm sorry, SPSS. This is what it looks like in SPSS, where SPSS has all your variable names, and SPS then also has over here, this is where the data is. So it has the data variable view where you see your variable names. So here's all the variable names going down here. And in SPSS, you also have to come through and tell it whether it's a number or a string. So like ID is a number, right? So that's what says numeric. So like if you go over to ID, there's ID, it's a number. On the other hand, if you come down here, this one here, class 1. Class 1 says it's a string. A string means it's letters. So if you go over to that variable, then here, that's class 1 going down. So the SPSS is a program that you can go through and you can actually do some statistics in. What I do then is that I'm not a big fan of using statistics for SPSS, and so I like to use SAS. So what I do is I save it into a SAS data set, and then that's what I do everything in. So I'll show you what the SAS data set looks like. Rudy, you don't use SAS, right? You use
no, I don't.
You use Stata. Yeah. So when you go through it, and work with a data set, do you do anything different than what I've talked about?
No, I pretty much do everything in Stata, so pretty comfortable with the same software.
So when you read in a data set, do you just read it right into Stata?
Yeah.
And then how do you define all your variable names?
I do have a do file on the side, actually.
What's a do file?
And that's where I keep all my notes.
What's a do file?
It's pretty much like a clean sheet where you save all your codes. So all your codes are there, so you don't have to just write it on this data software alone. So in case you want to go back to it later on or something goes south, then you can always go back to that specific do file and make changes to it.
Yeah, so in SAS, SAS has a similar type thing. So there are two ways that in general that you can do statistics on a statistical package. So if you look at SPSS, let's look at this. Let's go back to SPSS here. Where is it? Okay, so here's SPSS. And so let's say if I want to go through and look at, I want to compare uh, general health, right? Between, how about between people who work and don't work? Well, you can come up here to analyze, and you can come down here to, let's see, where's t-tests? There we go, compare means. So we'll do a one sample t-test. And so, oh wait, try it again. Come down here to compare means. All right, so we'll come down and we'll pick out general health. And then we'll pick out work and see if this works. So then you can see these results. Can you see this result table? I'll make sure you can see it. So what it does then is it gives you a result table like this, where it sort of says, okay, so here's, here's your, pair one is that you've got this mean, and that it's going through and comparing it. So you can do it with, you can do like, different type of statistics in SPSS. The problem is that you don't have a record of what you did. So that if you want to go back and figure out and remember what you did or figure out later, is that you're just doing drop-down commands. So in SPSS, you write something, you can write a little program, I forget what it's called. It's a different type of program in SPSS that you can write. In Stata, you can write a do file, and a do file is where you have all your everything. In SAS, what you do with SAS is you do this, is you write this type of program. So what this says is that, okay, it gives me a title. It says reading in sleep data. For the lib name, that's the library that you want to, that you're going to tell the computer, go to this place because this is where the data is. And so I have it on my C drive. I call it PH1112 sleep. So that's where it is. Then it reads in this file here, academic performance version 1. And then what I did here is I said, okay, I'm going to take this variable called PSQI9, and I'm going to give it the value, I'm going to give the name sleep quality. Why did I choose that? Well, I chose that because if you go to the, if you go to your, Pittsburgh sleep scale that you used, right? So here's the Pittsburgh sleep scale. This is the one that we used in the survey. If you go to your Pittsburgh sleep scale, you notice that here it says question 9 is your sleep quality. Now you notice that if you go down and look at this, it gets pretty complicated how you code it. So I didn't have time to go code the entire thing. So I thought, well, let's just only use that variable then. And that will be our sleep quality variable, which is, and so notice that you have to pay attention to how it's coded. So in this case, very good is a 0 and 3 is bad. So it means that for this variable, sleep quality, the higher the number, the worse your sleep. Okay, so remember that. So now what this says is that this says, okay, so now this is my stress question. Well, if you read over the, if you recall, we had a stress questionnaire, and the stress questionnaire had, let's see, where is it? The stress questionnaire looked like this. And it had all these different questions. So we included all these questions in there about stress. But then you have to, if you go down there and, for any of these questionnaires like this that we use, these are validated measures. So make sure you know what that means. These are validated measures. So what you do is when you use it, you go and you read how you score it. So in this case, it says, that for questions 4, 5, 7, and 8, reverse the numbers. So what they mean is, like, if you look here, overall, how stressed have you felt? So on question 3. So if you do very often, give it a 4, that means you're very stressed. If you do 0, that means you're not very stressed, right? But like if you look at question 4, in the last month, how often have you felt confident about your ability to handle your personal problems? So now very often is good, right? So for question 3, very often is bad. For question 4, very often is good. Same thing for 5. For 5, in the last month, how have you felt that things are going your way? Very often is good. So what it means is that for these 3 questions, 1, 2, and 3, if you having the answer very often, 4, means it's bad. For 4 and 5, very often is good. So you need to switch these items around so that essentially it means that if you answer a 4, you're going to give it a score of 0. Same thing for 7 and 8. So that's what this means down there. So the way you do that is that you create a variable, like in this case, that's called, stress R, which is just the reverse of stress. So that I said, if stress 4 is equal to 0, then stress 4R is equal to 4, and did it for questions 5, 6, 7, and 8. Finally, is that I have this variable work status. So if you remember what work status said is that, do you work full-time or don't work? You work part-time, you work full-time. Well, I just created a variable which sort of said, okay, if they said that they don't work, well, then we'll give this value work a 0. And if they work, we'll give the value of 1. This then is how you combine all the stress variables to make a variable called stress. And this is then the academic performance variable. So what academic performance looks like is this here. So your academic performance is essentially a 1 through 10 scale, where 1 means you're going to get a D or lower, and 10 means you're going to get an A+. So it's basically just a measure for each class that goes through and says for each class, what do you think you're going to get from that? So this was the primary academic performance measure. So how do you use that? Well, I kind of said, well, maybe what you do is you just sort of take the average of all your class grades. So what I did is that for every respondent, I just took their average. At this point, you're thinking, this is confusing. And you're right. That's why I decided not to give you an assignment on it, because I thought, I could sort of see where it would take you a while to kind of work through exactly what we did, or what was being done for each of these things. So I'll just show you the results. So this is what it looks like then when you go through and you actually do the results. So this is the mean. These are means now, the data. So we have basically 60 responses. So if there's only 58, like here, n is equal to 58, that means that 2 people didn't answer their age. So the mean age was 21. The mean academic performance was 7.0. So if you recall, it's a 1 to 10 scale where 10 is an A+. So 7.0 is about a B+, a B or B+. So people, on average, think that they're going to get a B+. The mean stress is 2.5. Remember, it's a 4 scale where 4 is bad. So 2.5 means that more than half likely stressed. Sleep quality is a 0 through 4 scale, 4, 0 through 4 or 3 scale. So essentially it means that in the higher the number, the worse your sleep quality. And then I also did these ones in terms of the, because I was really interested in this, in terms of, how important it is to come to class. If this question was class no mandatory, means that if you didn't get enough sleep, how likely are you to miss class the next day if it's not mandatory? And so out of a 5 scale, where 5 was very likely, means you're about 3.3. And this one said, how likely are you to miss class if it is mandatory? Not very likely. And then this says, how important is it to come to class if it's mandatory or not mandatory? And you can see people generally thought that it's more important to come to class if it's mandatory than not mandatory. That says to me that in the future, all my classes will be mandatory. All right, so this is just, these are what the numbers for the academic performance. So one person reported that they thought they're going to get D's in all their classes. Too bad. And then, up here is that 2 people thought that they were going to get A's or A pluses in all their classes at this level. So that's a 9.3. Here's your sleep quality, 1 through 4. Remember, and then ethnicity. So if you want to know, well, so what's the ethnicity, like 1 through 5? Well, what you have to do is you have to go back to the questionnaire and see, well, what's a 1 through 5? So if you go back and you look at the questionnaire, you see that, so come down here, down to ethnicity. So here's the gender question. Ethnicity, so was 1 was white, non-Hispanic, 2 was Hispanic, 3 was African-American, Black, 4 was Native American, 5 was Asian Pacific, 6 is Caucasian, and 7 is other. And so the results, from the survey said that you had essentially, come back, 2 self-identify as white, 65% as Latino, 10% as African-American, and et cetera, going down. So that's how you interpret your ethnicity questions. So you can see when you make tables for this, is that what you do is you take this information here of your frequencies, but then you plug in the names, the values of this from the survey. So in doing these types of the data management, is that you have to go back and forth a lot of time between the surveys and the results in order to make sense about what it looks like. So work status, so 35% of the people didn't work, 55% worked part-time, and 10% worked full-time. This is their place of work, where it was on campus or off campus. So notice that here, missing was 21 numbers, and that 21 is the number of people who said they didn't work. So this question was only asked to people who work. So this is then what this variable work does then is combine the work status. So 21 people didn't work, 39 did work. This is your, would you miss class if it was non-mandatory? Would you miss class if it was mandatory? Importance of coming to class if it's non-mandatory? Importance of coming to class if it's mandatory? And this then says, well, what would you prefer? Would you prefer your classes to be mandatory or non-mandatory? Where 2 was non-mandatory, 1 was mandatory. So about 40% of people would just prefer to have all mandatory classes. So good news, people. In the future, I expect you're going to have more mandatory classes. Now, this is a general health question, where general health goes from 0 to 1 to 5, where 1 is bad, 5 is excellent. And so the way you use a general health question is you can use it by these categories, or you can take the average of it. So the average of this number is basically the average general health. Okay, and here's what the results look like. So now your dependent variable is academic performance. So how well they think they're doing. And then your independent variables are age, are the year in school, are whether or not they work, the amount of stress, and sleep quality. And so remember, the academic performance, higher scores are good. So if you say, does sleep quality, is it associated with poor academic success? The answer here is, what do you think? If you're looking at this, is sleep quality, how would you interpret that answer? Well, first off, what does this negative number mean? It means remember that sleep quality, the higher the number of sleep quality, the worse your sleep quality is. So it means that the worse your sleep quality, the lower your academic performance, right? That's kind of what that means, the negative number there. And here, it means that the older you are, the worse your academic performance is. This means the further you are in terms of years in school, the better your academic performance. This means that if you work, the better your academic performance. And this means that the higher your stress, the worse your academic performance. Is that clear? But then you look over here to this column, because this tells you whether it's significant or not. And what you're looking at is this number less than 0.05? So is that number less than 0.05? Yes, but that's just the intercept. So that one, that's not, the intercept you don't worry about. But in looking at these numbers, which of these variables is less than 0.05? Is P less than 0.05? Put it in the chat, which variable is less than P is less than 0.05. There's only one. I see work and sleep. That's half right. It's either work or sleep. Which is P less than 0.05? Work. That's right. So it means that work is the only significant variable. All these other ones are not significant. This means is that you don't reject a null, right? So the only one that's significant is work. So it means that people who work more tend to have higher grades. Okay. Then there's this one. So now what this says is all right, so sleep quality now is the dependent variable. So now we're going to look to see, well, what predicts sleep quality? And so if you look at these variables here, are any of them less than P less than 0.05? Are any of these variables here significant? You have to give me a yes or no. Are any of those variables significant? Significant means P less than 0.05. No, that's right. None are significant. This one is what's called marginally significant. Oftentimes, if P is less than 0.10, it's called marginally significant. And so you would think this says that that the higher your stress, if you look at this coefficient, it's positive. So the higher the stress, the more likely it is that you're going to have poor sleep quality. Higher stress, poorer the sleep quality. So it says that, but in terms of work status doesn't seem to lead to more poor sleep quality. The year, not really related. and age is not really related. The only thing that's related is just higher stress means poorer sleep quality. Now we could do the same thing for distance. You know, we could look at on campus versus off campus to see whether or not, so other types of factors. Is there anything else that you want me to, you know, that you want me to kind of to look at since we've got the data here? Any other questions you want to see answered?
So what does the t-value like represent?
Good question. So the parameter estimate is basically that's your, you know, that tells you the well, what it tells you really is the relationship between your independent variable age and your dependent variable quality. So I can see how this is negative 0.04. That means that it's you know, as it's negative related. So as the older your age, as you get older, your sleep quality, you know, the value of the sleep quality goes down. Remember, sleep quality, high numbers are bad, low numbers are good. So it says that older people tend to have better sleep quality. So that's what that sort of says. But to know whether it's significant, what you have to do is you have to consider, well, you know, is this significantly different than 0? And so to do that, what you do is you have to consider how much of the variation there is in those type of answers. That's what the standard error kind of gives you. The standard error tells you how much variation there is. Then what this is, the t-score, it's basically just the standard estimate, the parameter estimate divided by the standard error is your t-score. And that's how you do your statistical test. So if you notice, this says probability greater than the absolute value of t. Well, what they're talking about is like, is this t-score significantly different, big enough to be significantly different from 0? And the answer is no, it's not. Since it's greater than 0.05, you would say that this t-score is not very big. Like if you come up here, this, not that one. You know, here was the significant variable for work, right? And you notice that this t-score is 2, and that's significantly different than 0. Typically, a t-score of greater than 2 is going to be, or greater than, you know, less than -2, is going to be significantly different than 0. That's kind of a, you know, how the significant tests operate. So keep it in mind. I mean, if you've taken statistics, hopefully that they talked about t-scores and what t-scores means. If you haven't taken statistics, hopefully they'll talk about what t-score means. I'm not going to ask you, I'm not going to assume that you know what t-scores means, but I will kind of want you to understand the signs here and understand whether it's significant or not. Any other questions? Okay. Well, that's how you analyze data, right? And now what you would, you know, if you were doing this as a report, what you do is you would probably report both the quality scores, I mean the sleep quality scores, and also the academic performance scores on this. And now, you notice not a lot of things were significant. So a big reason for that is that you only had 60 people, or like here, only 55 people were included in this. So that's, you know, where it says corrected total up here, that's your number of people who are in the, you know, whose data were used on this. So there's only 55 people. And it's oftentimes very tough to find significant results with only 55 people, because the more people you get, the smaller the standard errors get. And the smaller the standard errors get, the bigger the t-value gets. And the bigger the t-value gets, the more likely you are to be significantly different than 0. That's really what get a big sample does. A big sample, if you remember, I showed those graphs initially where I said as your sample size increases, your distribution gets smaller. That distribution is essentially the standard error. So if you were to do this again with 300 people, then all of these things would probably be significant. which is why when you do, when you do surveys, is that you need to go through and figure out how many people can I get from my survey? If you can only get 20 people for your survey, then you're very unlikely to get significant results. On the other hand, if you can get 1,000 people for your survey, then you're very likely to get significant results. So like, Rudy, you're doing a survey right now. Rudy, are you still?
Yes, I'm here.
You're doing a survey right now, right? How many people are you getting for your survey?
For study number 1?
Study number, oh yeah, do study number 1. How many people do you have?
That's about 1,900 people.
1,900 people. Are you finding
Yeah.
significant results on
Yeah.
things? Yes.
Yeah.
Probably everywhere, because when you have 1,900 people, you have significant results. For your discrete choice survey, how many people are you getting?
The goal is to get 300.
300. And then how many questions are you asking each person?
There's about,
Well, you have 16 different scenarios, right? Or
Yeah.
16 different
Mhm.
questions. So your
yeah,
your sample size is really 300 times 16. So it's really what?
gonna be
4,800, something like that, 5,000.
Yes.
So with 5,000, I'm going to predict you're going to get significant results. Because if you
Mhm.
get a big enough sample like that then you could go through and that you can, you'll get significant results. Okay, question is to explain the parameter estimate again. Sure. So the way that, so when you look at these types of results, and this is the same type of thing we've been looking at in tables throughout, right? So, I tried to pick, so this is something that at least you should have some type of recognition that you've seen this before. Because, this is what they show, right? They show in these tables, these parameter estimates. So the way to think about this, the parameter estimates is that, well, this shows the relationship between your independent variable and your dependent variable. So sleep quality is your dependent variable, age is your independent variable. And when it's negative related, that means that as age goes up, the value of your sleep quality variable goes down. When it's positively related, that means that as work goes up, the value of work goes up, the value of your sleep quality variable goes up. So work in this case means that do you work? 1 is yes, 0 is no. Sleep quality, high numbers are bad. So it means that people who work have, well, do they have better or worse sleep quality than people who don't work? I'll check the chat. Do people who work have better or worse sleep quality than people who don't work? Notice the number is 0.37. So give me a write in the chat, either better or worse. 50-50 shot. Better? What if it wasn't better? Worse, right? They have worse sleep quality because as work when work equals 1, then sleep quality goes up, and high number for sleep quality equals bad sleep. Therefore, high work means high sleep quality number means poor sleep. So that's why, when you interpret these things, you have to look at how the variable is defined. Like here, we'll go back up to this one. To this here, right? So this is now academic performance is your dependent or independent variable. Is academic performance the dependent or independent variable? Write it in chat. Dependent or independent? I'll give you a hint. The name's right in front of it. Well, it's dependent. It's your dependent variable, right? Is because it says right here, dependent variable, academic performance. These things then are all independent variables, right? So now academic performance, high values mean good academic performance. Low values mean bad academic performance, right? So in this case then, and work is equal to 1 means you work equals 0 means you don't work. So notice that you have a value of 1.070 is your value here. Does that mean that if you work, do you have better academic performance or worse academic performance? Better, that's right. You have better academic performance because as work goes from 0 to 1, it means that your dependent variable goes up. Dependent variable is academic performance. The higher academic performance, the better. Is it significant? Is it a significant predictor? Yes, it is. Because you come over here and P is less than 0.05, so it's significant. Let's take stress. Does high score on stress means you're under high stress? Does high stress lead to better academic performance or worse academic performance? Better or worse? Worse, that's right. High stress leads to worse academic performance because you have a negative score here, right? So the higher your stress score, the lower your academic performance goes. So negative score. Is it significant? Is it significant? No, exactly. It's not significant because P is not less than 0.05. So P is greater than 0.05, so it's not significant. So if you know those two things, because I'm going to give this to you on the test, if you know those two things, if you know how to interpret the coefficients and you know how to interpret the p-values, that's really what I want you to know. Good? Questions about that? Did you do one more? Sure. Okay. In fact, we could do, let's see, let's pick another one to do. Which one should we do here? So we've done academic performance. How about this? How about we'll do proc reg and we'll do model. My favorite thing is class import for no mandatory. Whoops, come back. Class import for no mandatory, right? That means that we're going to look to see how important do you think who it is that thinks that's important to come to classes that are not mandatory. And we'll look at we'll use these things as our independent variables: age, work, year, whether you work, amount of stress you're under, and then sleep quality. Oh, and let's put in academic performance too. Academic performance, right? So, and now we'll run that model. See if it worked. Okay, so here you go. You have, this is your dependent variable, the importance of coming to class when it's not mandatory. And these are all your independent variables. So remember, for this variable, important to come to class when it's not mandatory, it means that if you come to class. I mean, that 5 means you think it's important, 1 means it's not important. So let's take age. Do people who are old, as your age goes up, do you think it's more important to go to classes that are mandatory? Or less important? Do you think that people, as your age goes up, do you think it's more important to go to, do people as they get older think it's more important to go to non-mandatory classes or less important? More. That's right. More important because this number is positive, not negative. Is it significant? Is it significant? Yes or no? Is it significant? Yes, it's significant. Okay, if you look over here, P is less than 0.05. Now let's see what other variable here is significantly related to important of not coming to class, or thinking important of coming to non-mandatory classes. What other variable in this list is significant? Stress. That's right. So here's stress here, P less than 0.05. And are people who have high stress, do they think it's more important, or do people who have high stress think it's less important to come to class? More or less? More. That's right. More, because notice that this number is positive. Okay, let's do one more. We'll do the same thing. See if there's any differences coming to classes that are mandatory. I don't think that we're going to find much because I think everyone thinks it's important to go to classes that are mandatory, but let's see. Okay, so this is now your dependent variables important to come to class that are mandatory. Anything significant other than the intercept? Are any variables significant? What do you think? Yes or no? No, nothing else is significant. Nothing else explains it is significant. And that's because, everyone thinks that going to class when it's is mandatory was important. So therefore, that's why I didn't think we were going to find anything, because, there's no variation, right? If everyone thinks the same thing, that there's nothing to explain. In this case, for this one, for the non-mandatory classes, some people think it's important, some don't. Tends to be that older people are older tend to think it's important, and people who are under stress think it's important. Make sense? Any other questions? Do you want me to give you this in an assignment? So that, give you this type of thing for an assignment so you can practice it? Give me a yes or no. Would you rather have a 10 on the assignment, or would you rather have an assignment whereby you have to practice one of these things? Give me, say, either 10 or assignment. 10. I see 1 10. And the other 10, 10, 10. Okay, fine. I get the idea. You'd rather not do an assignment. Fair enough. Okay. I'll go through this. I'll go through this. I'll give you a practice. I'll send through a practice one. And then and we'll go through it on Tuesday for a review session. Good? Okay. All righty. Any other questions? Okay. See you. Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Have a good break.
You too.
Good weekend.
See you on Tuesday.